John Travis in Novato, California on the 5th of June, I believe. I forgot to check my calendar. Talking to my co-author and longtime friend and colleague, Regina Ryan in Paulden, Arizona. And we go back 1978. 32 years, yes. And we wrote a book together, and then another one, and then we revised the book together, and again. But we haven't seen each other for like 20 years.
How old does that make us?
Yeah. What I want to do today is to fill in our viewers on your role as a pioneer in wellness, which preceded my knowing you. And I was lucky to find you and to create our colleagueship. But I want to begin with who you are and why, starting with where you were born and how you grew up and your childhood influences and all those things. And then we'll get to your career and what we've accomplished. So take it away, Regina.
So my mom was in a hospital in the Bronx, and it was VJ Day, August 14th, 1945. Oh. And they were celebrating in the streets, and they were drinking champagne, and they were setting off firecrackers. And she was in labor, and I came in on the 15th, and I was excited that everybody was applauding me as I came in. You know, it was really amazing. That
what an entrance. Airplanes I remember the airplanes in the sky because I was 3 years old then. Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I came
always done things with a flair, Regina. Somehow I'm not surprised.
Yes, and I came in also on one of the biggest feast days of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which was the Feast of the Assumption of Mary into Heaven. And so hence my name, Regina, from Queen. And also that was the Regina Caeli, Queen of Heaven. And that has been a defining influence on my life and my path, is my relationship to a spiritual my spiritual orientation from my birth. And yeah, then I was the oldest of 7 children, good Irish Catholic family. And my parents are both deceased, but all of my 6 younger siblings are still alive. Mm-hmm. And they're all on the East Coast, and I'm way out west. So I got out a long time ago, and we have good relationships. We are recently just seeing each other again on Zoom for family reunions, which is kind of nice. So I was raised in a very beautiful Catholic home. And despite the fact that so many people have such horror stories about their upbringing in Catholicism, mine was actually quite wonderful. I had a mother who was a great devotee of Mother Mary and Jesus, and my dad was a stalwart, Catholic man, and a bit rigid, but a good one. And yeah, my mom used to go on retreat every year. She needed a retreat because she had 7 kids.
That brood.
So needless to say, I grew up as a little mother, taking care of my brothers and sisters all the way through. But, it's what Catholic families did in those days. The older kids took care of the younger kids, and people had 7, 8, 9, 10 kids, and there's nothing out of the ordinary in those days. So, so I went to Catholic school, and I met these wonderful nuns, and I said, this is the best. I think that their life is pretty cool, and they don't have all these little kids running around the house, and the house isn't always a mess. And so I think I'll go there. It's a lot more peaceful than this chaos that I'm living in here, despite all my mother's good intentions. You can imagine a household of 7 young ones. So So my growing up was putting my attention into my studies. I have a number 1 in the Enneagram, which makes me very
I have
desirous.
one also.
Yeah,
I didn't know that either. We know how it should be, and this ain't it.
exactly. So yeah, but the convent was definitely it, because they had it all together, and they had a beautiful habit, and as long as they stayed there, they were going to go to heaven right from the get-go. So it was a very appealing life. And so I had a wonderful high school life, and I went to the
Like,
convent when I was 18.
were you like class president and
I was senior class vice president, and I was the chairman of the senior prom committee, and I was a championship debater.
oh,
Duh.
really?
Yeah. So we would travel around the country and do debates. So that's how I got so good at working with you, because I could just take whatever side I wanted and, have a repartee. So
I had no idea what a formidable.
formidable adversary you had.
And we definitely had our debates in the early days, for sure. Just backing up for a second, what kind of work was your father doing? And I gather your mother was a stay-at-home,
Yeah, you better believe it.
except for her retreats.
Yeah. Well, we lived on Long Island. My dad was a salesman. He sold tax guides, law services that lawyers still use to this day. His territory was Rockefeller Plaza in New York City. So he was back and forth on the train from Long Island to the city every day. He made a good living. It wasn't extraordinary, but it was good living. He could raise 7 of us without a problem. So he's a book person. He sold books, which is what I do too. So.
Yeah, following in his footsteps. Well, you write them.
I write them, but I'm also
Well done.
an editor and part of a small press, and
Yeah.
we're always coming up with ideas. How can we sell books?
So what other things in high school were you noted for? Or is that was quite a list already? Are there any others?
Well, I was very noted for my height, because as you know, I was 6'3" when I went into high school. And that's at age, 13, 14?
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine that was a bit different from most of the kids, most of the girls anyway, in high school. And the boys, who were tall basketball players, they weren't interested in some tall gangly gal. They wanted the cute little girls. So my height has actually been a very defining factor in my life. The fact that I have a name that means queen, the fact that my middle name is Sarah, which means princess, and the fact that my last name is Ryan, which means little king. So I fully enacted my birthright, and I let them know who was in charge around here.
And you're a 1 on top of it.
Better believe it.
Wow. And you settled for vice president of the senior class.
Well, they had to have a boy.
Oh, okay, of course. In those days.
Yeah.
Wow. Are your other siblings tall? And which parents, or both? Were they tall? Or?
Yes, my dad was 6'6". My mom was 5'10".
Mm-hmm.
I have 6 younger brothers and sisters. My brothers are all 6'8", 6'9", and 6'10".
Oh, wow.
My sisters are close to my height, or they're 5'10", 5'11", 6'1", 6'3". I'm 6'3". And so when we would go to Sunday church with the whole family, when we were teenagers, and we would sit in the front row of the church, nobody could see over our heads, because the Ryans created this total wall of.
I'm surprised they didn't consign you to the back row.
Well, the beauty of my upbringing was that because my parents were tall, they were in good shape. They were athletic, both of them. And my dad was, up until the time of his death at 83. He was a world champion oarsman.
Oh, really?
And up in his late 80s, in his early 80s, he was even competing in those oars machines, those, I forget what they call them, but they're these international competitions where you meet in big centers and you row on these rowing machines. And my dad died as the senior world champion. So
Wow.
that was a cool deal. So yes, because of their height and their just innate dignity, both of my parents were quite dignified. They just instilled in me this type of regard and respect for my size, and the fact that I could use it to my advantage, which I definitely did.
You did.
I didn't get invited to the senior prom, even though I was the chairperson of the prom. So I had to actually get some girl's brother to come to take me, because I had to show off the amazing dress that my mother made me.
Uh-huh.
And then I became a nun. But my friends in high school were all saying, they're going to this school and they're going to that school, and what school are you going to? And I said, I'm not going to go to college. And they couldn't believe it, because I was one of the smart kids. And I said, no, I'm going to go to Las Vegas and be a showgirl. So. So I don't think they really believed me, but it was a good story anyway.
So you were a jokester as well.
Oh, well, sometimes.
So tell us about your time in the, what's the proper term? It's not monastery, is it? Convent, yeah, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, well, like I said, from my earliest years, I had a very strong orientation to a spiritual life, which in those days, I didn't exactly know what that was. I just knew that when I walked into the church, or when I held my rosary beads, or when I went to communion, there was something that was really cool that I really liked. I loved the silence. I loved the spaciousness of a sanctuary of a church. And I loved these nuns who were really cool people, smart and savvy. And so it was not a big sacrifice for me. I was really excited about the possibility of having a life like that. And I threw myself into it like a number one would. I folded my apron more perfectly than anybody else. My novice mistress told me that I would be the best nun in the graveyard. And that was one of my early introductions to the teachings of impermanence. So I got to walk to the graveyard in the mornings and contemplate the fact that that's where I was going to end up, and how was I going to spend my life. So my training as a nun was actually quite wonderful. I loved it. I loved the fact that I was learning a type of attention and presence that my college friends weren't necessarily learning in quite the same way. They were going off to San Francisco in those days. This was 1963. And they were listening to the Beatles and, tuning in and dropping out and so on. And I was learning how to speak the name of God with every Venetian blind slap that I dusted. So, or to remember myself at the head of every staircase, and, make an internal prayer every time I took a step. So those were skills they were training steps, that have endured throughout my life, and I have great gratitude for them. And then what happened was, in my early convent experiences, I was a fourth grade teacher, and then I was sent to a large high school, and this was in the height of the Vietnam War. And I was very highly influenced by my studies, and very much in line with the radical protesters who were protesting at that time, and was torn, because I had Thomas Merton and that whole contemplative tradition pulling me at one side. And I had Daniel Berrigan burning draft records, pulling me on the other side. So it was this kind of very important time of decision for me. I was counseling young men in conscientious objection so they could go off to Canada or whatever they were going to do. And having some prayer vigils and peace marches against the war. I didn't actually go down to Selma or those places. We were a little stricter than that in our community, but I did gain rather a reputation for being somewhat of a radical nun. And my high school students appreciated my work with them.
This is in New York or New Jersey? Or?
This is in Long Island, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Huntington, Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a time of decision. Was I going to stay and continue to work this way and make the convent my life, or was I going to step out into a broader community where I was not quite as restricted in my ability to make a difference, or at least that's how I defined it at the time. And so I left then, and with many tears with my friends who are the nuns, and just not knowing really what I was going to do with my life. I didn't leave to get married. I went off just because I was feeling this urgency to move into a larger dimension, which actually wasn't all that much larger, but it was maybe even deeper. So like I say to some people, I'm probably more of a nun now than I was then, but in a whole different context. So
now I'm curious, you probably got the equivalent of a college education in the convent, or the training, the teaching.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, I got an undergraduate degree as a nun. I got an undergraduate degree in speech and theater education. My minor was radio and television production. I went to St. John's University in Jamaica Plains, New York.
Okay. And
we were a very highly educated community. They were called the Ursulines, who were kind of they're the sister community of the Jesuits. Mm-hmm. And so very highly educated women. And then I actually I received a scholarship for a master's program there. And started that. So are you getting some?
We're losing some audio.
Okay.
I'm hoping it's still going to record when this happens. The recording usually is okay because it's recording to the cloud.
Oh, okay. For a while there, it was just giving me feedback on everything I said, but right now it's fine again.
Yeah, I was getting some silence, but I don't think we missed too much. Let's hope it was temporary.
Okay. So where are we now? What are you asking?
You were starting a master's program, I think.
Oh, yeah. God, is this boring or what? Are people going to?
No, it's fascinating. This is stuff I didn't even know. I mean, it's what made you who you are, and
perhaps
part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I started a master's program as a result of a scholarship, and then midway through that, I determined that I was leaving. And then I got a graduate teaching assistantship at Colorado State University, and left the convent, went out to Colorado State, began my master's program out there, also in communications with radio and television as a minor. And that's where I met my husband to be at that time. He was a Catholic priest at the Newman Center, which is the Catholic educational center that's on secular campuses. And we met because he was running support groups using transactional analysis, which was something that you and I had in common quite a bit. And I joined his group, and we became friends. And then one thing led to another, and he he applied to Tom Harris's Institute out in California to go out and study more. And he was at the point of also exiting the priesthood, and asked me if I'd go out with him to California to the Harris Institute, which we did, to study. I'm okay, you're okay.
Yeah. And what was that, like a year-long program or?
Oh, no. It was only a few weeks. That was the beginning of a complete tour of the States and Canada for us in our little car, traveling around looking for a spiritual community, because we had both come out of religious communities. Mm-hmm. We knew the value of living with other people. We had no children in our life. I was unable to bear children. And so we were looking for like-minded people who might have a radical edge. And so we did. We traveled and visited some places and met some wonderful people and did the whole tour, and then got back to Fort Collins, which is where I was completing my master's program. And he got a job in the next town. And then we got married in 1973.
Mm-hmm. And was that in Greeley that you settled? That's where you were when I met you, but.
Yes. When I graduated with my master's from Fort Collins, I moved down to Greeley with him. I worked as a Project Head Start teacher. He was a psychological counselor. He had a doctorate, and so we had a very sweet life in Greeley, Colorado. And and then I got involved with the Association for Humanistic Psychology, as you know. And it was through that I really got to see the world. I mean, and lots of famous people, including this amazing doctor, John Travis. So the rest is history. Yeah.
Well, my view of that is a little different, but you were the head of Rocky Mountain AHP, I believe, and you were organizing a conference when I met you, but prior to that, you said you got to see the world, meaning the world came to you of the people you brought in, or were you traveling? And
Yeah. No, the world came to me, and I was also began to travel to these conferences that the association was putting on. So I was going out to the Bay Area, and I was going to Princeton, New Jersey, or wherever these things were happening. And the conferences we were putting on in Denver, we were bringing in people. We were bringing in people like yourself. We were bringing in Natalie Rogers, and we were bringing in, just half the names of them escape me right now, but I was getting to meet many wonderful people from the local area, as well as the guests that we invited in.
Well, I think Alberto Vieldo was on your ticket when
yes.
I met you.
Oh, definitely.
But, I met you in 78, or I think it was 78. Yeah. But you started with AHP in 73, so there was a 5-year period in there.
Yeah, something like that. I'm not too good at remembering exactly when all these things happened, but yeah, I know we met in 78 because our book didn't come out for another 2 years, so it took us at least 2 years.
Well, it was we didn't actually start the book for another year, but AHP was you knew Liz. What was her name? That was
Liz Campbell.
Yeah, and I had some contact with her through you, but we could probably jump into how we met, which for me was amazing. I lived across the street from Susan Campbell, who was living with Barry McWaters, who you had invited to speak. And I didn't know Barry very well, but somehow I didn't even know Susan that well, but we've since become close, and I consider her a mentor. But we turned out to be on the same flight. So we rode to the airport together, flew out, and we get to the airport, and you were there to meet him. I was flying out. I wasn't invited to the meeting. I was going to the founding meeting of the American Holistic Medical Association that Norm Shealy and Gladys McGarry had set up, which was at the Regency Hotel. You were at Regis College. Regina, I mean, this is a Queen weekend of all sorts. But anyway, I show up at the airport and you walk up with platform heels looking down at me. I'm 6'5", with this enormous shock of red hair. You stopped me in my tracks. Like, who is this woman? And, you know, we exchanged some pleasantries, and you took Barry off to the conference on the campus, and I got to the hotel, and I'm not sure how I had gotten to know Alberto prior to that. I must have run into him somewhere. I don't even, maybe at the airport. But he said, "Oh, I know Regina." So I managed to take off from the conference, which is kind of boring. And actually it was Tom Harris was there, and he was drunk, and he went right after my presentation and dissed me. Another connection, which was, you know, all this weird stuff going on. So I wound up going out to the campus where I met you again, and we hit it off. And I had just split up with my partner Joy, and so you had an open relationship with Jerry. We wound up dating long distance, and we went to the Rocky Mountain. What's the place? There was a conference up. What's the place up in the hills?
Park.
At the park, there's Estes Park, yeah. So I came out for that, and we're riding back in the car. Our relationship, I think, because we were both ones and whatever, we weren't hitting it off that well. And out of my mouth came the words, "How would you like to write a book together?" And I don't know why I said that. And you said that, what's your friend's name? Ruthie had told you something that week about you ought to write a book. And David Isaacs had been on me for years about writing a book, and I didn't think I could do it because I had to take remedial English when I got to college. I'm not a writer. And do you remember your response? We were in your Volkswagen, I remember, coming down the hill from the mountains.
No, I know, you tell. A good story.
I remember saying that, and you're saying, yeah, it was like a possibility. And it was like, what? And how that unfolded then, we got together and drafted some sample chapters. I already had a 3-ring binder version of the Wellness Workbook, which was very dry and boring because of my scientific writing. And I recognized that you could provide the juicy text and you know, make it be appealing to other than doctor types. So
well,
we
let me
drafted.
Let me interject this, because as I remember it, we got together. I probably came out to Mill Valley for our first meeting, and we got together with the idea that I would be your ghostwriter, that I would be a ghostwriter with you, and that
I forgot. You're right. Yes.
The book would be published under your name, but I would be along, and you would pay me for this. So you sent me home after we had worked for the weekend. You sent me back to Colorado, where we were living at the time, Jerry and I, and you said, now take this chapter and do it the way you would rework it, you know, and add things and so on, and then send it to me, and we'll see if this is going to be a good working relationship. That's how I remember the story. So we don't let the facts in the way of a good story anyway. So then I sent you that chapter, and the way I remember it is that you read my up-leveling of your core material. And you said, well, I don't think I want you as a ghostwriter. I think I want you as a co-author. That's what I remember. And
Well,
I said,
that makes sense. I didn't remember that detail, but
oh,
I had thought of you as a co-author from the beginning, but that's
oh,
quite
no, not
possible.
first. Yeah.
Yeah. And I actually have a copy of that draft that we put together. It was in I found it.
Yeah.
So then we, I think Annie Styron knew some publishers in New York. She had just married George Leonard, and she sent them off to these publishers, and they kept saying, well, it's not one book, it's 12 books, because we had divided up to 12 chapters of what had been my wellness energy system. And we kept saying, well, yeah, but there are those 12 books. No one's put them all together. We didn't get very far. But then it was Don Gerard, who had been doing the Random House Bookworks book. The Well Body book had been a major influence on me. That's what turned the corner for me, which he had published along with the massage book and lots of others. And he told me about an agent that I should talk to, George Young, who it turned out wasn't an agent, but the second in command at 10 Speed Press. So he comes over, looks at our material, and offers us a contract. Well, I guess you were in Colorado, but he offers me a contract for us. And that's how we landed 10 Speed Press, which was up and coming. You know, they hadn't done the Moosewood Cookbook yet, but they were just about, What Color's Your Parachute was their big,
Yes, that was it.
Their big name. So we got a contract. We got a few $1,000s advance, and we set at it back and forth. I came to Colorado, you came to Mill Valley. We had to do it on a typewriter and longhand and
With carbon paper, I would come.
yes.
I was writing everything out on big legal sheets. That's how I worked. And then I would work it over, I would edit it and work it over on the legal paper. And then I would take it to my typewriter and I'd put it in with carbons and I'd type. And so I could send you the copies. That's how we worked.
I'd go through and edit and so forth. And then I think I'd have our secretary retype it, and it was crazy. You know?
But that's what we did. That's what we did. So you did it, you know.
Yeah, yeah. And I then went off to Costa Rica after we turned in the manuscript in December of '80. And it came out in June, I think, of '81, just when I came back from Costa Rica. So we suddenly were published authors. And,
that's how we became rich and famous.
Yes. Well, we got a little bit of fame out of it, and then you went on to do lots more books. But we were pretty burned out. You went off to India at that point. I was in Costa Rica. And let's pick up with your story then again with any other things about the grueling, as it was described, like a marriage without sex, of being co-authors. We were pretty burned out when we turned in the manuscript. So.
Well, I don't know what it was like to work with me, but you know, you had your ups and downs, and so it was personalities, and it was brilliance, and it was struggle, and it was excitement, and it was the whole 9 yards. We did it all, and we stayed in communication, we stayed in communion, and mostly because of my saintly nature, I kept giving in to you. But other than that, it was.
So what led to your Rajneesh, and that would have been happening right around that period, right?
Yeah, I went to India in September of 1980. So the book came out in June or or was coming out. I thought it came out in June of 80, not 81.
No, it was 81. We
It's
turned
81.
it in 80, yeah.
And I just,
So
then I hadn't seen it because I left for India in September of 80.
well, let's go back to your spiritual evolution of how you got involved with, as he was known then, Rajneesh, now Osho. What was your first contact? And let's fill in your spiritual evolution here, because that's a big part of your life.
I'd say, yeah. So, so Jerry and I were continuing with our path of Christianity, despite the fact that we both, left our religious communities. And somebody turned us on to, I know what happened. I was at this conference and I met this Rajneeshi, that, they were wearing red and all that. And I get to know this guy, and he's a pilot for United Airlines. And he says, oh, okay, so you were a nun and you're a Christian, blah, blah, blah. He said, if you knew that Jesus was still alive, would you go to see him? And I said, yeah, sure. So he said, well, he is. Doesn't look the same, but it's the same essence. And he's in India. And so you should read these books and maybe you'll be interested. So he turned me on to this series by Osho, or Rajneesh at the time, called Come Follow Me, which is Osho's commentaries on some of the Gospels of Jesus. And I brought those home, and Jerry and I began reading them. And we were both deeply touched because we hadn't found the same degree of aliveness in many of the Catholic theologians that we were reading. This was very contemporary. This was funny, and this was powerful, and this was clear, and we just really loved it. So we got involved with a group of Rajneeshis down in Denver. We were living in Greeley. Got involved with them, and we'd go down once a week for meditations, and we were doing these incredible meditations, chaotic meditation, where you're jumping and screaming, and this was like, whoa, this was really different from my upbringing in Catholicism and in the convent. And my darling Jerry, he was on the sidelines a lot more of the meditations, but he was into the books and into the love aspect of the whole thing. So yes, so it was really powerful and wonderful. And with Jerry's blessing, a good friend of mine who was also involved in Osho's work and interested, we went off to India for a 3-month stay, which turned into a 9-month stay. And Jerry stayed home and took care of my friend's daughter and supported me throughout the whole process. And I got there and I couldn't leave after 3 months. It was just too insanely wonderful. It was like Disney, the Disneyland of the spirit. Because it was a foreign country, it was exciting, and it was all day long doing meditations and dancing and music and meeting new people and hanging out in cafes. And and I'm not so sure it was, but I maximized the opportunity. But let's say it was, I had gone to college as a nun. So this was like me going to college, not as a nun. So I got to do everything that college kids would do, but I got to do it in India and wearing long red dress and dancing and, the whole nude encounter groups. And we had so much fun. And then I got hepatitis, which kept me there a little longer than I would have liked. And so I came back, and Jerry was very interested in it, in this teaching and in this work. And so we both determined that we were going to go off to Oregon, because Osho had, during the time I was there, he left India and went to the ranch. And so we determined we were going to go up there. And then right before we were set to go, we had sold our house. We had given away all our things. I met a very radical spiritual teacher from California, who I don't want to speak about right now. I don't want to mention names on these tapes, but he had a small following, and I was completely smitten with the idea that I was going to have this fast and furious road to enlightenment. And so Jerry went up to Oregon, and I stayed and went out to California. And he lived up there for 9 months and was part of the incredible experiment that was happening up there. He was an engineer, and he helped build a gigantic dam and all of that. He had wonderful life experiences. And I went off with this teacher who ended up to be rather insane, and I ended up pretty broken and wandering around downtown San Francisco, wondering who am I and so on. So I called Jerry, and we got back together again in Iowa, because I have a very dear friend out in Des Moines, my friend Anita, who was willing to host the two of us and let us heal and rest and be together again.
So you never were in Oregon. I thought you were there with Jerry.
No,
Oh.
I never went to Oregon. I was in California going crazy, and he was in Oregon.
I remember when you were in California, but I thought that had come afterwards.
No, I never went.
Yeah. Okay, so you're in Iowa healing, and this would have been what, 82 or 83, somewhere in there.
Yeah, 83, 84.
Mm-hmm. I was coming back from Costa Rica around then.
Yeah, 83 and
Mm-hmm.
Early 84. And then friends in Denver, our friends Jim and Ruth, invited us to come back and live with them. And we did. We went back to Denver, and we had a communal household with them and their.
That's right. I remember that. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and that brought us back to that area. And there we were, teaching. I started teaching again because now I was a famous writer. So the local college just opened the door and said, come on in and teach this course called wellness, because, you seem to know what you're doing. So, that, I'll tell you, that book was a calling card at a time when I really needed a job. I had just got out of being completely insane, even though I had written this book on wellness. I was a complete basket case. So.
Well, teach what you need to learn, I keep saying.
Certainly
in my case. Well, then around 86 was when we were asked to do a second edition.
Oh.
And it was supposed to be like 9 months, and it took 2 years because it didn't come out till 88, and they ran out of copies of the old one, and it was a long, gruesome process. But at least we had K-Pro computers, and we did it on disk.
Oh my gosh.
And that made it a lot easier.
Our K-Pro computers, the size of a printer, one of your printers, and with a handle, walk around town. I took it on a Greyhound bus from Greeley, Colorado to Phoenix, Arizona, because now I had met my new teacher, who I lived in association with for the rest of his life. And I was carrying that computer on a Greyhound bus to go down there to visit him in Arizona. So.
Well, I used to use it on the bus in Costa Rica going up to Monteverde. When there weren't enough seats, I'd sit on it. They were built to be used by the military. They were built for tanks, so they're solid. They make a comfortable seat if you put a cushion on top. Anyway, we did a second edition, and you're teaching. And when did we do? We did the little book. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was when 50 Ways to Save the Planet or some such book came out. Or was it 101 Ways?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
That was a wildly bestseller. And our publisher said, let's do a 50 Ways to Save Your Wellness. I remember George calling me up, George Young, our editor, saying, let's do 50 Ways to Save Your Wellness, ha ha. And so we mocked it up with 50 different things. And then their editor went and seamed it all together as text, which destroyed the beauty of the individual pages that we had, one a day or whatever. And it didn't do very well. What was it? The title was Wellness: Small Things You Can Do to Make a Big Difference, some such. And we thought it was going to take off because the workbook had sold moderately well, but it wasn't really reaching the masses. It was becoming a textbook, and it was too dense for most people. So we wanted to get into the mass market. So that was the next step in our history. But now you've gone to Arizona, and let's pick up with your evolution there. And Jerry then joined you, and at some point, but I don't remember the details.
One step back, since this is my pioneer of wellness talk, I have to get back my pioneer girl hat on and tell you that when I met you, I was teaching a course at Ames Community College in Greeley, Colorado. Mm-hmm. And I was teaching a course called Psychic Healing. And I had been teaching communications and different public speaking and so on at that college. And the reason I got to teach psychic healing was a good friend of mine was on the faculty there. And that was the big thing in these days, was everybody was into psychic healing. And he said, then he had surgery and he couldn't get into the classroom. So he said, well, why don't you teach it? I'll give you all the materials and you just go in and teach it. So I began to study about this newly emerging field of how the mind affected the body, affected our health. And it evolved from a course called Psychic Healing into a course called Holistic Health. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I had been teaching for at least two or so years when I met you. And, having had the experience of teaching and knowing names like Norm Shealy and so on, it was the opportunity to take that, what I had, I had classroom notes and studies and so on. So that's what oriented me towards being able to say yes to you, because I already had a background in that emerging field. Even though I can't say I was some great practitioner of wellness at the time, but I was a good teacher and I knew how to synthesize a lot of material. And I think that's what allowed me to work with you. So that's a little backtrack on our pioneering history.
That in,
yeah. So back to we're still in Colorado, and I've come back from India, and I Jerry's come back from the ranch, and I've come back from my crazy teacher, and now we're settled in Greeley, Colorado again, and or Denver, actually. We were living with our friends there in Denver, and I'm always reading spiritual books and doing my program, and the work with Osho was wonderful. But when Jerry got back from the ranch, we were both kind of clear that we had appreciated the experiment and the work there, but it wasn't home for us. It was not the home of the depth work that we wanted to continue to do. So I began to pray and look and open myself to the possibility of another teacher in my life. I've always appreciated having a guide or mentor, a spiritual friend in the spiritual path. And then a friend of mine said to me, well, there's this guy coming to Boulder, and you can come and hear him and see him. And we both went, and this was in 1984. And my teacher's, and the man's name was Lee Loswick. And I first met him, thought he was terrible, went away. And then second time around, had a very incredible experience of hearing him on the radio and practically fainting because the power of his words just impacted my body. And I didn't like this guy at all. But I thought, well, you better give this guy a second chance because something he's saying is resonating with truth for you. So I did, and went back to see him in 85, March of 85, and never left. So we stayed in Colorado, and then And then he went back to his ashram in Arizona. And then just about a year later, we moved down to Arizona. Oh no, it was about 3 years later, we moved down to Arizona, and we've been here ever since. Of course, Jerry's passed away. He died last August at the age of 84 and a half, or 84 and 3/4. But I'm living in the heart of the ashram now. And Lee died, of course, in 2010. So our community has maintained, and we are functioning without a living spiritual teacher, but we maintain a practice and a work. And it's kind of like we have a sanctuary here now that is available. So that's where I am.
Recall early on you describing him as the rock and roll guru, and you'd go to Germany. And so describe more some of the antics that your spiritual life has impact, what you've done there.
Yeah, well, as one looks back at one's life, I'll be 75 this summer, and you look back at your life and you say, did I actually make those choices, or did those choices make me? And you kind of feel like I said to you that from the get-go in my life was oriented towards a relationship to God, and I was always on that spiritual journey. I don't feel like I actually chose that. It just was so right that, and then, as you know, I was with some crazy people for whom after a very short time, it wasn't right. So I feel like just being able to feel into what's right for you, what's not, what's working for you, what's not, without a whole lot of rationalization about it. I found a home. I found that home with Lee, and he was not at all the prototype or the best model of what I was looking for as a spiritual guru or teacher. I mean, in fact, I would have loved to have had a woman teacher, because that was way more juicy for me to have, this divine mother person. But he was not that at all. He was short. He was a little bit chubby. He was Jewish. He was from New Jersey. He told terrible jokes. He could write. He didn't write very well. I was early on asked to be his editor, and I was like tearing my hair out, at that. But the heart essence was there, and he started a rock and roll band very early on in the community. But when I was there, and I traveled with them all over Europe, and several times, and to Mexico and into Canada and all over the States and so on. So I got to be a rock and roll groupie for my guru's band. And
were you singing or playing an instrument? What was your role?
My role was just tagging along and taking notes and writing up stories for our journals, our in-house journals. And
I pictured you singing.
Oh no, I never got to be a singer. It was they missed it. Right, their chance to get me on stage. But I was taller than all the musicians, and those, I was too tall. So anyway, the fun of it was that he was, like I said, when I was with Osho, it was taking me into a domain that I had never explored in my usual spiritual life, and Lee the same. Because I remember, sitting in bars in Berlin, underground Rathskellers, places where the Beatles had played very early on or something, and just going, what's a good Catholic girl doing in a place like this? And recognizing that his particular orientation towards a tantric view of life, which is not limited to what a lot of people think of as tantra, which is, kind of a free-floating sex experience. It's the ability to work in all domains of life, and without the denial of that this is bad, this is good, this is bad, this is good. And that's exactly the kind of teacher I needed, because I came from this is definitely bad and this is definitely good. So my whole life with him as it had been also with Osho, and I'm very grateful for both of those, was a moving beyond that kind of rigid understanding of what the spiritual path was all about. So yes, he was wild the very first time I saw him, which was why I thought he was horrible. But it was in a formal ceremony where people bring, they bring fruit and flowers to the guru and they bow down before him. And I watched this whole thing, and somebody brought him a jar of pickles and he went, oh, and he got off his throne, and he put the pickles on the throne and he got down on the ground and he started going like this, pranaming to the pickles. And then the next person who came up gave him a big wedge of brie cheese and he ripped it open and he sat there talking and eating brie cheese in his hand. And I thought, this is not spiritual at all. Forget this guy. I don't like this guy at all. So I ended up there because something else happened. And beyond the form, he was actually a provocateur in that way. But with me, his teaching was very, very unique, very personal, as he was with each of his students. And he knew he had to work very gently with me because I needed a lot of tender, loving guidance so as not to completely freak out and end up in a pile of tears. So he guided me through many, many, many years. And so I was with him from 1985 until his death in 2010. This was a long journey, and I'm still central to his work now here, 10 years
How
after.
many are in the community now?
How what?
How many are in your community there?
In Arizona, there's about 80 of us.
And are you mostly together in one location?
We're mostly in the States. We're mostly in Arizona, yeah. And then we have some outreach groups in Colorado and Washington and California. So it's little over 100, 150 people in the whole country. And then we have an ashram in France. And then we have a large group in Germany, and we have another ashram in India.
Now, where you are now, is it a group, a community shared living?
It's a shared property with small residences on a 120-acre property in the desert of northern Arizona, and we have small residences of small groups, couples and families, small families, and we have periodic, we have daily practice that some people attend, and we have, ceremonies morning and sunset and sunrise, and gatherings together on Sundays. Of course, everything's changed in the last number of months with the COVID situation. But in general, yes, we are living communally, although we're living in separate residences with a big community house for gatherings and a big community meditation hall for practice.
Mm-hmm. Now, how many in that immediate community?
There's 16 of us residents in this small residential thing, but then there's many houses in the environment that are not on this 120 acres, families and so on in this area that join us and are with us. So, and we have gardens, and we have solar power, and we have rain catchment, and we're off the grid, and we're green here. So it's
all right.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to go back to your writing career, because you then took off and written how many other books? Like, I lost count. But the first one was, you broke your leg, right? And
yes, I broke my leg skiing. And, that sounds really sexy, but I was waiting for the lesson, and I was on the bunny slope, and I was practicing what I knew was going to come up, which was this snowplow maneuver. And I went about 3 feet and twisted and broke my leg. So there I am. Not like they had to send out sled dogs, to take me down off the mountain. I was right there. but I was in a cast up to my hip, and it was a bad break. It was a spiral break, and so I'm laying in bed and I'm saying, this sucks. You know, let's not do this. So I wrote this book called Good in Bed, and I subtitled it The Fine Art of Recuperation. And so when I sent it around, Jeremy Tarcher's company took it, but they thought the title Good in Bed was probably a little bit misleading. Unfortunately, I wish they had kept that title. I think it might have been better, but it became The Fine Art of Recuperation. And that was the next book after you and I had worked together. But I had a reputation already. I was a famous writer, so I could just walk in the door and get my book published. Woohoo!
And that's still in print?
No. So here's what happened. So the book was going out of print, and I work as the managing editor of our communities press, because we started off publishing the works of our teacher Lee, and then we branched out into publishing other works. So we have two branches. We have a health and wellness branch, and then we have a spiritual book branch. And so when it went out of print, I asked my co-workers here, who are just my friends, and I said, "Shall we take it back and republish it?" So we took it back, and we republished it as oh God. Hold on, wait a minute. This is called the senior moment. We republished it with a new title, and it was about getting through surgery, trauma, and accidents in a wellness perspective. So it has a really good title, but that's the essence of it, and it still sells. So it's still available through, now it's called Kalindi Press. That's the branch of our wellness books, wellness and health books. And so it's called After Surgery is the title, After Surgery. And the subtitle is 10 high-powered wellness ways to, recover from accident, trauma, illness, and so on. So
it sounds like you reworked it quite a bit as well.
Yes, we did. We worked it. I did, or updated it, up-leveled it, so that became After Surgery. And I still love to read the comments that people write on Amazon when they buy it and use it. And people give it to their friends as gifts when they've gone through surgery. So
I'll have to check that out. Yeah. And then you went on and wrote some spiritual books. So tell us about those.
Yeah. Oh boy, this is getting to be big. So, I as a part of Lee's community, and as also because of my background in Catholicism, I had long studied the writings and the spirituality of great women from Catholicism, but also of many other spiritual traditions. And I found it to be incredible to bring together this feminine face of the divine. And it's not like it hadn't been done before, but it hadn't been done a whole lot. I really hit the cusp there when this kind of feminine spirituality was really moving, and in the early 90s. And I wrote the book called The Woman Awake, in which I really was kind of a memoir. I kind of told my story through these female deities and divine mothers and great women, and showed this contrast of a sort of feminine face of the divine rather than this singular masculine face of the divine, which is pretty much what I grew up on, except for Mother Mary. And so it certainly expanded my understanding of Mother Mary and all the aspects of the feminine. So we divided it into, I keep saying we, I must be talking in that royal we once again that I tend to do. But it was the dark face of the Divine Mother. It was the face of loneliness and aloneness and silence and the face of the devotee and the face of the mother of the Divine Mother, the motherliness of the mother. And so, yeah, so it was very, very well received, and still well received. I loved the journey, and I loved then giving workshops to women, groups of women, and introducing them to another possibility. So I've been to Mexico and Canada and to Romania about 4 times now, because their relationship to Mother Mary there is really profound. The biggest holiday in Romania is my birthday. The Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary is the biggest holiday in Romania. So I have a good audience there.
Yeah. And then the Praying Dangerously title is always stuck in my mind.
Yeah, well, you can thank Andrew Harvey for that. Andrew Harvey, I met him at at one of those book conferences, and we had a conversation, and I was telling him about this book I was almost finished writing called Dangerous Prayer. And he said, "Oh, no, you mustn't just label it like that. You must make it active." He says, "How about praying dangerously?"
Oh,
So
really?
I said, "Oh, Andrew, that's really good." So with his endorsement and Brother David Stendelross and all these cool people who were willing to endorse it, I plunged into that. My teacher, Lee, told me to write it. He said, "Write a book on prayer, but don't make it the usual book on prayer." He said, "Write from your heart, write from your own experience, not from other books." And that was a tremendous invitation, and a tremendous opportunity to explore really what was prayer about. And the bottom line I came up with was, I have no idea what prayer is about. I just know that keeping that connection alive has so many dimensions, and is just so vital to my life and to the life of so many people. So yeah, Praying Dangerously it still goes. That one goes very well. It's been revised. And
Uh-huh. And I think there's a couple more, aren't there?
yes, after that I wrote a book called Igniting the Inner Life, which was also in that domain of, I came back from a very significant trip in Romania where I met a 90-year-old monk who had been imprisoned for 20 years in Romania during the regime there, and he was very influential in igniting my own inner life and inner journey. And so that book became about pilgrimage, about the nature of the inner search and its relevance to our day. And then my teacher, Lee, asked me to write a biography of his master, who was an Indian saint named Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar. And so I went to India and hung out there for 3 months and interviewed people and wrote an 840-page biography of this Indian saint. It's called Only God. And
840 pages. Wow.
yeah, it is formidable, believe me. And it's my ticket to heaven. It's the thing I'm going to die with, so that when I die, who's ever up there at the gate, I say, "Look,
There it is. That's your
this is how I get into heaven." So that book happened, and that was a most awesome life experience. And then we, with our health and wellness contingent, we were very much interested in the whole notion of breastfeeding, because Lee was a big advocate of conscious parenting and breastfeeding. Mm-hmm. And so never having been a mother, never having, born my own child, yet being a writer, I co-authored with a dear friend of mine who was an IBCLC, a lactation consultant, a book called Breastfeeding, Your Priceless Gift to Your Baby and Yourself, which then became an English version and a Spanish version with just wonderful pictures and 20 ways in which breastfeeding supports children. And let's see what else. Mm-hmm. And mothers and the world and so on. So that book still does well for us. It doesn't quite buy me a new car, but it does, it does sell copies. And yeah, it's promoted all through programs for WIC programs, Women, Infant, Children programs in the United States, and through Head Start programs with the populations that don't have quite as much access to these kinds of services that the government is sponsoring some programs for. So we're selling those in big quantities. So I don't know what else. I wrote another book called, I forget another, God help me. Another book called Stand Up, which was an anti-bullying book without using the word bully in the title. It was another children's book. And
I didn't know about that one.
yeah, I'll have to send you copies of some of these, Jack. So, and then I wrote another book. I put my teacher Lee's core teachings in a book of 365 short one quote a day, like paragraphs or two. I did that, and now I'm working on a couple more. So on and on it goes. It's
Wow.
Wonderful life.
Well, and just to go back and fill in the last chapters of our co-authoring, we did a revision of the Wellness Workbook and came out in 2004. And that wasn't quite as gruesome as the 1988 one, as I recall. I think Maren helped a lot with that one. And we also did another version of the little book, which did a little bit better. Simply Well was the title.
Simply Well, that was good. Better title.
Yeah, we worked pretty much long distance. We had the internet at that point and so forth. So that's your book history with some overlap with mine. I'm astounded at all the titles you've pumped out, and to me, doing a book is like an enormous. I'm off of books now, more than I can handle. I edit other people's books, but anyway, you've got the gift of writing much more than I do. I'd like to move more into your personal life and coming to a conclusion here fairly soon before we run out of disk space and the recording. But with Jerry, and for us, a lot of wellness now is about aging and dying. And Bobby, our colleague that helped me start the center, died 4 or 5 years ago and was a model example of a wellness death with a whole community around her that supported her. And from what you described with Jerry, I think, and I've just been listening to Zach Bush's work on both the virus and the pandemic and death. He had a lot of experience with hospice and the expansiveness of it. So do you feel comfortable sharing some of your experience with Jerry's last days in wellness terms?
Oh, I'd love to, because if you ever want a model for that process besides Bobby, Jerry could be it. He was just not into the what Stephen Jenkinson calls the death trade of, more is better. Just keep me alive at any cost. That was definitely not his thing. He was diagnosed 5 years before his death. He was diagnosed with a rare condition, which is a variation on Parkinson's, which is called PSP. Progressive supranuclear palsy, and there was no cure for it. So why did he didn't even want to bother going back to the neurologist, because they kept, what they would do is just examine him and say, well, there's where you are and there's nothing we can do for you. Yeah. So He just really wanted to use his time as valuably as he possibly could. So he did. He used his time with his the deepening of his own spiritual life. He read voraciously in the great teachings of the world and the great authors. He was reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in his last 5 years, and
Wow.
and people were just coming to sit with him and talk with him. He was doing a type of counseling that was just totally, not formal, but just because of who he was and his presence, he was just able to sit with people and talk. And he loved this phrase that the author Stephen Jenkinson used in his book, Die Wise. Somebody would say to him, "Jerry, how you doing?" And he'd say, "Well, I'm getting wrecked on schedule." And that was his sort of his motto. And he went from stumbling to using a cane, to using a walker, to using a wheelchair, to then needing to be assisted for all of his important functions. He could still feed himself at the end, but and then at the very, very end, he began to have pain. The last month, he began to have pain. We took him to the hospital emergency room just to get a test to see what was going on, and we found out he had pancreatic cancer. It was just everywhere. So we were so relieved. He was so relieved, because then he knew that we didn't have to go through another 3 to 6 years of this debilitating condition. And it was like, great, let's go home. Let's go to hospice. We went back home. We had been in Canada for the summer. We came back to Arizona, and we opened his sick room, his hospice room in our ashram, to our entire community. People came and went all hours of the day and would sit there, and he would kibitz with them and so on. And he would advise people, talk to people, and he kept a little supply of prayers next to the bed. This is a quote from Teilhard de Chardin, and here's a quote from Thomas Merton, and here's a quote from Black Elk. And he would, like, whoever was into whatever, he was like giving them little holy cards of these inspiring quotes. And I was doing my best to let this be my work. I prayed that he would die before me, because I wanted to serve him in his dying process. I did not want to miss the opportunity to guide him or support him through the death chamber. And I was given that grace to be able to walk with him through that. And he died beautifully. Oh my God, it was just awesome. We had a team of 3 other women who supported me, and we took shifts, and the hospice people came in, and then when he died, we said particular prayers over the body, and I had another team of men who came over, and we washed the body and dressed him, and we laid him in repose in the ashram. And people came again, all for 3 days. We had him in repose at our ashram, so we never had to leave the property. We never had to go to a funeral home. We never had to go to a crematorium, where nothing. It was all done right there, and it was beautiful. And on the 3rd day, we somebody built a pallet, and we covered it with flowers, and we carried him out to the hillside on our property, where our ashram building manager, a woman, had dug a wonderful hole with her backhoe, and we had a community-wide celebration, and really joyfully laid him to rest. So now he's here, and his body is here, of course, and I can go to meditation practice every morning and just walk. It's about 300 yards into the hill, and visit his gravesite and have my morning chat and be off about my day. So he left us with a tremendous legacy. He left us with some very important words. He said, "Do not mythologize me." And that's been something that I've had to really remind people of many times, because he was such a servant, and such a yes person, so willing to participate in life. But he did not want that. He didn't want, and his idea of a good send off was, I'd rather just forget the whole thing. That was his advice to us. So nonetheless, but we did have a 20-minute ceremony and then carried him off to the hillside. So yeah, so it's been an ongoing grief for me, but grief in a way that I never would know before, having been with him for 50 years altogether. It is something that I would never want to go away. I mean, grief comes as sometimes, just the lapping of the waves at your toes, and sometimes it comes like a tsunami, and it's the surrender into it that makes it valuable to you, because on the other side there's emptiness, and on the other side of that tsunami there's just no mind, there's only heart. And I don't ever want that to go away, because my dedication in my spiritual path is to live from the wound of the broken heart, because otherwise, how's my compassion going to be expressed? So thank you for asking. He's a wonderful, wonderful human being who left a wonderful legacy. And his main message to me when I visit him every morning, if I say, what should I do? He'll say, live worthy of us.
It's interesting. Joy's husband died around the same time. It was a Thanksgiving, I think, a year ago. And she's had a number of experiences where, psychic experiences, I guess is what you'd call them. I'm curious, given your leaning in that direction, has Jerry pulled any pranks with you? Or I've heard this from a number of people who have had close mates die, and anything like that on your...
No, I can't say that he has. He's been, I keep saying, would you come in dreams? And a couple of times I've gotten a little glimpse, but when I visit his gravesite in the mornings, if I have anything on my mind and I just speak it, then the answer arises from within me. So I could say, oh, he's guiding me, but I don't know how to put that together. The only other sweet thing is that we edited a book on preemies for our health series, and it was called Brave and Strong: A Preemie's Journey. And I needed a pediatrician to write the forward, and I was like racking my brain. How are we going to get a pediatrician? And who do I know is a pediatrician? Maybe I should call Jack, and maybe he knows some pediatrician or something. And then I'm up with Jerry one day, and I'm saying, like, how can we get a pediatrician? And then it comes to my mind that his nephew is married to a pediatrician. She's a female in Denver, and her last name is Premuk, which is the same name as Jerry's. Jerry's last name is Premuk. So we have our book, Brave and Strong, and we have it with MD, Lori Premuk, MD, forward. And that is, I think, that's the sweetest gift he's given me so far.
Yeah.
The tangible experience. And honestly, I had not even thought of her. So.
Interesting. Well, it sounds like there may be a book in the making too, from describing your experience with him, and at some point. I also want to acknowledge that I'd never heard of Stephen Jenkinson until we had some contact 2-3 years ago, and you said you were sponsoring him to come do a workshop. So I looked him up, and lo and behold, he was doing a presentation 5 miles from me in 3 weeks.
Wow.
So I signed up, and I thought, 3 hours, yeah, I'll probably slip out early. I was so blown away by him that then when he came to Mill Valley the next year, Yvonne and I went, and he had more than just the one guy with him. He had a woman playing music as well. And I downloaded his recordings, and I just got one the other day. He's got a new comment out about the virus that Kent sent me. Amazing guy.
Mhm.
Thank you for that gift.
Oh, welcome. Jerry read that book 3 times, Stephen Jenkinson's Die Wise, and then he read his Come of Age, which was about eldering. And then when Stephen came, Stephen and Jerry had this beautiful communion with each other. So I feel like he got a blessing from Stephen before he left.
Yeah, yeah. Well, any final words of wisdom for our viewers in the future? We hope will watch these videos and learn from their elders.
Yeah. Well, it's been a privilege, Jack, to have been an integral part of your work in making wellness more than running and eating. And
Or dog food.
what?
Dog food was the #1 Google hit for many years. It's finally moved down to #6. They stole the word.
So, I mean, just to bring to the attention of the world at large and your work, your very initial work interviewed by Prevention Magazine and so on, just by the raw humanity of your willingness to speak about how health was so interconnected with so many aspects of our lives, and just refusing to prescribe or operate unless there was some specific kind of circumstance, but just to changing that mentality. It was influential for me to be able to work with you, and yeah, I really thank you for the contribution that your life is, and I'm proud and bless the gratitude to the powers that be that brought our life together, and really thank you, and I wish you wellness.
Well, the same to you, and it has been quite a ride. It still is.
It still
So,
is, Jack.
I will end the recording here, and thank you for your participation and gifts and all the wonderful things that you're continuing to do.